The wind crosses a battlefield that should be celebrating victory. But it is not. Flags lie in the mud. Horses wander without riders. Armor is torn open as if the fight itself lost patience. And the strangest thing is not the damage. It is the silence. Because this field does not belong to a defeated army. It belongs to the Mongols. For years, their enemies had only seen one ending. Cities burned. Kings vanished. Empires folded like paper before fire. When Mongol riders appeared on the horizon, rulers did not prepare for battle. They prepared their surrender speeches. They were not facing soldiers. They were facing certainty. But today, something is wrong. The riders are not charging. The lines are not forming. The commanders are not shouting. They are watching, calculating, stepping back. Not in panic. Not in chaos. In doubt. And that is the impossible thing. Because doubt is something the Mongol army was never supposed to feel. This is not the story of the battle that destroyed them. This is the story of the moment the world realized they could be destroyed. And once the world sees that, it can never unsee it. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. Before you can understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand what the Mongols were before it happened. They were not just strong. They were inevitable. For decades, their armies moved across continents the way storms move across open plains. Fast, unstoppable, and impossible to reason with. Cities that had stood for centuries fell in weeks. Empires that believed themselves eternal vanished within a single campaign season. When the Mongols arrived, walls did not save you. Armies did not save you. Distance did not save you. Even surrender did not always save you. And people knew it. Stories spread ahead of them faster than their horses could run. Merchants carried whispers. Refugees carried terror. Survivors carried silence. Entire regions surrendered to Mongol generals they had never even seen. That is power. Not when you defeat an enemy. When the enemy defeats himself before you arrive. The Mongols understood this better than anyone in history. Their greatest weapon was not the bow. Not the sword. Not the horse. It was belief. They built a reputation so terrifying that it fought battles for them. A city that believed resistance was pointless would open its gates without a fight. A king who believed defeat was certain would kneel before the first arrow flew. Fear is the cheapest army ever created. And under their leader, Genghis Khan, they mastered it. He had not been born powerful. He had not inherited a throne. As a child he had known hunger, exile, and betrayal. He learned early that survival did not belong to the strongest. It belonged to the most ruthless, the most patient, and the most willing to do what others would not. So he built his army that way. Every soldier was chosen for loyalty, skill, and obedience. Commanders were promoted for talent, not bloodline. Orders were followed instantly. Discipline was absolute. Punishment was swift. Reward was certain. It was not just an army. It was a machine. A machine that moved faster than any army before it. A machine that could vanish into the horizon and reappear where no enemy expected. A machine that used tricks, traps, and false retreats to lure opponents into destruction. Armies that fought them once rarely survived to fight them again. Between 1219 and 1221, one of the strongest empires in Central Asia was erased so completely that its greatest cities became ruins almost overnight. Names that once meant wealth and learning became warnings parents whispered to their children. Do not resist, or this will happen to you. That was the Mongol message. And it worked. By the time their riders reached a new border, their reputation had already crossed it. Kings who had never seen a Mongol soldier already feared one. Generals who had never fought them already doubted their chances. This is what made the Mongols different from every conqueror before them. They did not just win battles. They removed the idea that they could lose. And once that idea disappears, something dangerous happens. An empire stops preparing for failure. It stops imagining defeat. It stops asking what might go wrong, because it believes nothing can. That belief feels like strength. It feels like destiny. It feels like invincibility. But hidden inside that belief, like a crack hidden inside steel, is the beginning of collapse. Not collapse from enemies. Collapse from within. Because the moment reality disagrees with certainty, certainty breaks. And on a quiet battlefield far from their homeland, reality was about to disagree. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The Mongols would not be destroyed that day. They would not be crushed. They would not even truly lose. They would do something much more dangerous. They would hesitate. And hesitation, for an empire built on inevitability, is the first sign that the myth is dying. History remembers loud moments. It remembers explosions. It remembers last stands. It remembers great defeats where thousands fall and banners burn and kings scream orders that no one obeys. But history is not usually changed by loud moments. It is changed by quiet ones. The battlefield where the Mongols stepped back was not supposed to matter. It was far from their homeland, far from their capital, far from the places historians usually watch. No famous city walls stood nearby. No legendary fortress guarded the land. No great empire had gathered its final army there. Just a river, a stretch of earth, and an enemy who was already supposed to be finished. By every rule of war, this fight should have been simple. The Mongols had more men, more experience, more victories behind them than most armies in history would ever see. Their commanders had crushed kingdoms that once thought themselves eternal. And the man facing them? He had no empire left. No secure cities. No steady supply lines. No powerful allies marching to save him. He was the last survivor of a fallen dynasty, chased across mountains and deserts by the most feared army alive. By all logic, this battle was not a battle at all. It was an ending. The Mongols had ended hundreds of stories exactly like this. Cornered enemy. Final stand. Swift destruction. Move on. They knew how this ended. Their enemies knew how it ended. The world knew how it ended. But something strange happens when people believe they already know the future. They stop watching carefully. They stop questioning. They stop preparing for the unexpected. And the unexpected always arrives for those who stop expecting it. When the armies met, nothing looked unusual at first. The formations were correct. The commands were given. Horses shifted in place, ready for the charge. Bows were drawn. Dust lifted from the ground in slow clouds. Everything looked normal. But battles are not decided by appearances. They are decided by moments. And somewhere inside that clash, maybe in a charge that did not break the enemy line, maybe in a counterattack that lasted longer than it should have, maybe in a command delayed by seconds instead of obeyed instantly, something shifted. Not enough to see, enough to feel. Mongol units that always moved like clockwork hesitated. Signals were repeated. Riders turned to look for orders that should have been obvious. The enemy did not collapse as expected. He did not scatter. He did not beg for mercy. He stood. And when an army that always falls suddenly stands, the mind needs time to understand it. That time is deadly, because doubt moves faster than arrows. No soldier shouted, "We are losing." No commander declared retreat. No horn sounded panic. Nothing dramatic happened. That is what made it so dangerous. The Mongols adjusted. They repositioned. They pulled back to better ground. Any general could explain it as strategy. Any official record could describe it as tactical choice. Any court historian could write it as controlled movement. On paper, nothing was wrong. But paper does not feel what men feel. And the men who rode away from that field carried something new with them. Something they had never carried before after a battle. A question. Not spoken. Not admitted. Not even fully understood. Just a thought, quiet as breath. What if we are not unstoppable? That thought did not spread through the ranks like panic. It spread like a hairline crack spreads through glass. Slowly, silently, almost invisibly. The army still marched. Still conquered. Still won battles. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, something had. Because once doubt enters a legend, the legend is no longer pure. And legends are fragile things. They look strong. They sound eternal. But they are made of belief. And belief is easier to break than stone. The men who left that battlefield would never describe it as defeat. They would say the ground was bad. The terrain difficult. The timing inconvenient. The decision strategic. All true. And none of it the real reason. The real reason was something no empire ever wants its soldiers to feel. For the first time in years, they had seen the future refuse to obey them. Empires are not held together the way people think. Not by walls. Not by gold. Not even by armies. Those things help. But they are not the true foundation. The true foundation of every empire is a story. A story repeated so often, so confidently, so widely, that no one remembers when it began. A story that tells rulers they are destined to rule, soldiers they are destined to win, and enemies they are destined to lose. As long as everyone believes that story, the empire stands. The Mongols understood this better than anyone who came before them. Their empire was not just built on conquest. It was built on the idea of conquest, on the certainty that resistance was useless, on the belief that their victory was not a possibility, but a law of nature. And for years, reality agreed. Every campaign strengthened the story. Every destroyed city proved it. Every surrender without a fight made it stronger. The myth grew faster than the empire itself. It crossed deserts before the army did. It reached kingdoms that had never seen a Mongol rider. It entered courts, councils, and war rooms long before hooves touched their soil. By the time the Mongols arrived, their enemies were already afraid. Fear like that is worth more than 100,000 soldiers. Because fear fights for you. Fear opens gates for you. Fear whispers to your enemies while they try to sleep. But fear has one weakness. It depends on belief. And belief has one enemy. Evidence. That quiet battlefield, the one no one wanted to talk about, had given the world something it had never had before. Evidence. Not proof that the Mongols were weak. They were not weak. Not even close. They were still the most dangerous military force alive. They could still crush armies. They could still burn cities. They could still erase kingdoms from maps. But now, there was a story. A small one. A doubtful one. A dangerous one. A story about a battle where the Mongols did not win cleanly. Stories like that travel in strange ways. They do not march like armies. They drift like smoke. A trader hears it in one city and repeats it in another. A messenger carries it across a mountain pass. A diplomat whispers it behind closed doors. No one trusts it at first, but they remember it. And once remembered, it waits. Years before, rulers had asked one question when facing the Mongols. How do we survive them? Now, slowly, quietly, another question began to exist. Can they be resisted? That question is poison to empires. Because power does not collapse the moment enemies attack. Power collapses the moment enemies believe attack might work. The change did not happen overnight. Nothing dramatic marked the shift. No declaration announced it. No signal fire carried the news across continents. Just hesitation. A tribute payment delayed. A messenger ignored. A governor quietly strengthening his own forces instead of sending them to the empire's campaigns. Small acts. Harmless acts. Reasonable acts. But when they happen everywhere, they become something else. They become symptoms. Inside the Mongol command structure, something similar was happening. Their generals still obeyed orders. Their princes still led armies. Their banners still advanced across maps. From a distance, the empire looked exactly the same. But distance hides detail. Up close, the unity that once defined them was thinning. Commanders who once acted instantly now paused to calculate. Princes who once followed one voice now listened for advantage. Alliances were still formed, but now they were weighed, measured, questioned. Not because loyalty had vanished, because certainty had. And certainty had been the glue holding everything together. This is the strange truth of power. It does not fail when it is attacked. It fails when it is doubted. The Mongol Empire had not been wounded in its body. It had been wounded in its image. And an image, once cracked, never returns to what it was. The world had not seen the Mongols defeated, but it had seen something almost as dangerous. It had seen them hesitate, and hesitation is proof of limits. If you had looked at the Mongol Empire from far away in the years after that battle, you would have seen nothing wrong. Armies still rode. Cities still surrendered. Maps still changed. Messengers still carried orders across continents. Tribute still flowed in from conquered lands. Foreign rulers still bowed when Mongol envoys entered their courts. To the outside world, the empire still looked unstoppable. And that is what made the truth so hard to see. Because the most dangerous changes in history do not happen on battlefields. They happen inside systems. Quietly, gradually, without noise, without drama, without witnesses. The Mongol war machine had once moved like a single mind. Orders from the top became action at the bottom instantly. Generals did not debate commands. Princes did not question strategy. Every part of the empire believed it was part of one unstoppable force. But now, something subtle was shifting. Not rebellion. Not disobedience. Calculation. Commanders began asking questions they had never asked before. Is this campaign worth the risk? Is this order wise? Who benefits if this succeeds? Those questions sound harmless, sensible, even. In most governments, they would be signs of intelligence. But in an empire built on absolute momentum, questions are friction. And friction slows machines. Supplies that once arrived early now arrived exactly on time, or slightly late. Reinforcements that once rushed forward now paused to gather more information. Garrisons that once felt temporary began building stronger defenses, as if preparing for something uncertain. Nothing was collapsing, but nothing was effortless anymore. The change was so slow that most people inside the empire did not notice it. That is the nature of gradual decline. When something breaks suddenly, everyone sees it. When something weakens slowly, it feels normal. The soldiers still believed in their strength. The generals still trusted their tactics. The princes still believed the empire would last forever. But belief was no longer simple. It had become something they had to maintain. And maintaining belief is harder than having it. At the center of all this stood one man whose presence had always held everything together, Genghis Khan himself. For years, he had been more than a ruler. He had been certainty in human form. When he spoke, arguments ended. When he chose, doubts disappeared. His authority was not questioned because no one could imagine a world where it should be. But time is the one enemy no conqueror defeats. He was aging. Not dramatically. Not visibly. Not in a way that would alarm his armies. But age does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly, the way winter arrives, one cold morning at a time. The men around him began to notice things they would never say aloud. Moments of silence where once there had been instant decisions. Longer pauses before orders. More reliance on advisors. More attention to his sons. And his sons. They were strong. Ambitious. Capable. They were also rivals. While their father lived, that rivalry stayed hidden, like sparks trapped under stone. But everyone knew what would happen when the stone was lifted. The empire had no clear system for peaceful succession. No rule that guaranteed who would rule after him. No tradition strong enough to prevent conflict. As long as Genghis Khan breathed, unity existed. When he did not, no one could be certain. So beneath the victories, beneath the expansion, beneath the banners still flying proudly across half the world, a quiet awareness began to grow. Not fear. Awareness. Awareness that the empire's strength might not be permanent. Awareness that power might one day need to be negotiated instead of obeyed. Awareness that loyalty might soon become a choice instead of a reflex. These thoughts were never spoken in public. They were never written in official records. No chronicler dared to record them. But they existed. In tents at night. In private conversations. In glances exchanged between generals who suddenly understood the future might not be as simple as the past. The empire was still expanding. But expansion no longer felt like destiny. It felt like effort. And effort is the first sign that something once effortless is beginning to change. There is a moment in every empire's life that no one recognizes while it is happening. It is not the moment of defeat. Not the moment of invasion. Not the moment of collapse. It is the moment when the center stops holding. From the outside, nothing looks different. The borders are still wide. The armies are still strong. The rulers are still obeyed. Messengers still ride. Taxes still arrive. Orders are still carried out. But inside, something invisible begins to loosen. For the Mongol Empire, that moment came quietly, as most turning points do. And it did not begin with an enemy. It began with time. Genghis Khan, the force that had united tribes, crushed kingdoms, and shaped one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, was growing old. He was still feared, still obeyed, still respected. But age is not an enemy you can conquer with cavalry. Everyone around him understood a truth no one dared say aloud. He would not live forever. That realization did not cause panic. Not yet. The empire was still strong. Campaigns still succeeded. Victories still came. But beneath those victories, a quiet calculation began. His sons were not the same. Each of them was powerful. Each commanded loyal followers. Each believed he deserved authority. And each knew that when their father was gone, the question of who would rule would no longer be theoretical. It would be urgent. So alliances formed, softly, politely, indirectly. Commanders began aligning themselves with different princes. Generals listened more carefully to certain voices than others. Advice was weighed not only for wisdom, but for advantage. No one called it division. They called it preparation. At first, this changed nothing. Orders were still obeyed. Campaigns were still organized. Battles were still fought. But unity, once automatic, now required effort. And effort leaves traces. A decision that once took minutes now took hours. A strategy that once would have been accepted instantly now required discussion. A command that once would have moved 10,000 riders at once now moved them in stages. Nothing dramatic, just slower. Empires rarely notice when they slow down. Speed is easy to feel when it increases. When it decreases, it feels like caution, like wisdom, like careful leadership. But slowness is not always wisdom. Sometimes it is friction. The Mongol Empire had once expanded with the force of a landslide. Nothing could stand in its path because nothing could react fast enough. Enemies were still gathering their armies when Mongol riders appeared at their gates. Kings were still planning defenses when their cities were already surrounded. Speed had been their greatest strength. Now, slowly, that speed was thinning. Not because they were weak, because they were thinking. Thinking about succession. Thinking about loyalty. Thinking about the future after one man. And thinking, in an empire built on certainty, is dangerous. Because certainty does not ask questions. The old unity, the unity that had made the Mongol war machine unstoppable, had depended on one simple truth. There was only one center of power. One voice. One will. One decision that ended all arguments. As long as that center existed, the empire moved as one body. But now, quietly, that center was beginning to blur. Not gone. Not broken. Just less absolute. It is almost impossible to see the exact moment when authority changes from unquestioned to negotiable. There is no signal, no announcement, no line in a chronicle that says this is where it began. But you can see its effects. You see it when generals start calculating instead of obeying. You see it when princes start planning instead of waiting. You see it when loyalty becomes a strategy instead of a reflex. The Mongol Empire was still enormous, still feared, still victorious. But something essential had shifted. It was no longer held together by inevitability. It was being held together by management. And management is not the same thing as destiny. Destiny feels permanent. Management feels temporary. The soldiers did not yet know it. The conquered peoples did not yet know it. Even many of the princes did not fully understand it. But history did. Because history has seen this pattern before. The moment an empire begins to depend on balance instead of certainty, its ending has already begun. Genghis Khan's death arrived quietly, like the end of winter that no one notices until the frost has already left. He did not die on the battlefield. He did not die in a fire or a rebellion. Some say a fall from a horse. Others speak of illness. Some even whisper assassination. The truth is hidden, because empires hate to admit that the force that bound them together can vanish in silence. And when he died, the empire felt it immediately, though outwardly nothing seemed different. Armies still rode. Cities still surrendered. Tributaries still paid. Maps still spread wide. But the glue was gone. The center that had made impossible feats routine had vanished. And in its absence, the cracks that had existed for years widened. His sons, each ambitious and capable, now faced the impossible task of holding together something larger than a single man's vision. They did not share the same urgency. They did not share the same clarity. Each sought power, each sought legacy. The Mongol war machine, once unified under one mind, began to divide. Commands became inconsistent. Loyalties became calculated. Decisions were influenced by personal advantage rather than strategy. Even as some sons expanded the empire into new lands, pushing into Russia, Eastern Europe, Persia, and China, the empire was no longer a single force. It became four, then four within four, each fragment remembering the name Mongol but not the unity it had once carried. The Golden Horde in Russia began to chart its own course. The Ilkhanate in Persia consolidated but stopped expanding. The Chagatai Khanate fractured repeatedly, and the Yuan dynasty in China, perhaps the most organized, survived only by adopting Chinese bureaucratic traditions, court rituals, and infrastructure, becoming Mongol in name alone. Kublai Khan's empire was remarkable, magnificent, but no longer Mongol in spirit. The empire that had conquered half of Eurasia without resistance had, over decades, slowly dissolved not by swords or arrows, but by the very idea that once held it together, belief. The people had once feared the Mongols because resistance seemed futile. That fear maintained obedience, loyalty, and submission. But once that fear cracked, once the world glimpsed hesitation, the myth died. Without myth, loyalty became choice. And choice, when spread across vast territories, can destroy an empire faster than any army. The final battles, the defeats, the rebellions that historians sometimes highlight, the Battle of Jalut, the fall of the Yuan dynasty, the fragmentation of Persia, were not the cause of the Mongol collapse. They were the confirmation. The empire had already fractured decades earlier at the riverbanks of that forgotten battlefield, where soldiers hesitated, where doubt whispered in the ranks, and where the myth began to bleed. What remained after centuries of conquest was not power, not unity, not fear, but memory. A memory of domination. A memory of invincibility. And a lesson history rarely teaches clearly. Empires do not die when they are attacked. They die when they stop being believed in. The Mongols were defeated by time, by succession disputes, by the erosion of belief. No army, no king, no rebellion could have undone what the empire had already lost in silence. And in that slow dissolution lies the terrifying truth about power. It is always more fragile than it looks. It is always held together by stories, by myth, and by certainty. Remove certainty, even slightly, and what seems eternal begins to crumble. The Mongol Empire was not destroyed in a single battle. It was shattered in one moment, confirmed in many, and dissolved across decades. Its story is not of dramatic collapse. It is the story of quiet fracture, of myth failing, and of the realization that nothing, no matter how unstoppable it seems, can last forever. And that is the lesson left behind, not of swords and blood, but of belief and the terrible, unstoppable power of doubt. If you enjoy dark, untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.